My name is Michael Wesley. I'm the Director of Academic Outreach and Research Programs at the National Security College. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. Tonight is a special occasion for us because we're launching a book by one of our own, a visiting fellow, Professor Buszynski, and a wonderful book called Negotiating with North Korea. The seminar tonight will be slightly different from our usual seminars, which usually just has one speaker. I'm going to speak for 10 or 15 minutes about my impressions and reactions to the book, and then I'm going to invite Leszek to the lectern. He's going to speak for another 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll convene a discussion, a question and answer session after that. This is a book that I have to say genuinely, and I don't say this just because I'm launching it, this is genuinely a good read. This is genuinely an excellent book, and I commend it to you. At the outset, it is very much what it says it is. It is a close look at the six-party talks that were first convened in 2003 to try to bring about a denuclearisation of the Korean Peninsula. The six parties that it refers to are obviously North and South Korea, the United States, China, Japan, and Russia. This was a forum that, let me remind you, once held such high hopes. There was a period of time, I think sometime in 2004-2005, when security pundits were suggesting that the six-party talks would be Asia's new security forum, that this would be the place, unlike other security forums, where problems were actually worked out. And yet, the six-party talks ended in failure. They were inconclusive. They still exist on paper, but they have not been able to reconvene for several years. So it's a story of high hopes and ultimate failures. It's beautifully written, it's engaging, it tells a story from the perspective of each of the six parties, it's meticulously researched, and it tells you a heck of a lot about the region we live in. Like all good books, this book offers many useful perspectives for someone who is interested in these issues. One, and I guess most immediately, one of the reasons that I opened it up and read it for the first time was that it takes a close look at the North Korean regime and its strategic options. And the North Korean regime emerges as a regime that is crazy, but it's crazy like a fox. It's well aware of the strategic advantage that its own fragility brings it. It is able and willing to capitalise on its neighbours' desire for peace and stability and predictability in North Asia. It knows how to manipulate other countries, and it will use any levers it can. It knows how to manipulate Beijing as much as it knows how to manipulate Seoul, Tokyo and Washington. Another perspective that this book provides is an extremely useful perspective from the inside of a complex multilateral negotiation. The first chapter of the book looks at the process of negotiation. It spends quite some time talking about theories of negotiations and the structures of negotiation. It takes us inside the domestic politics of the parties as each party sets out its initial negotiating position. And quite fascinatingly, it shows how these initial negotiating positions are substantially pulled out of shape by the dynamics of the multilateral negotiation. Yet another window is into the complex and ongoing strategic dynamics of Asia. The dilemmas and pretensions of the region's non-resident hegemon, the United States. The feints and hedges of its ambitious rising power, China. the narcissistic hand-wringing of Asia's flatlining ex-power Japan, and the ambiguities and oscillations of the region's smaller states, not to mention the remarkable options that are available to a quote-unquote rogue state like North Korea. Ultimately, the question that inspires this book is, why was the power of the United States unable to prevail in relation to forcing North Korea's denuclearisation? Such a stark imbalance in power, why wasn't Washington able to prevail? And as with all good questions, it has a complex and fascinating set of answers. One answer to the question is what Leszek calls the structure of the negotiations, which saw the United States end up myopic and isolated and convinced of its own position, Beijing willing and able to be tricky and exploitive of not only Washington's position but the other parties' positions, and the South Koreans and Japanese both fickle and short-sighted. Another set of answers comes by looking much more closely at each position adopted by each of the six parties. It saw the United States under the administration of George W. Bush as cocksure and bombastic, determined to take the lead in the negotiations and certain that all other players other than North Korea were 100% behind its goal of denuclearising the Korean Peninsula. What emerged, of course, is that none of the other actors in the six-party talks had denuclearisation as its primary goal. Enter stage right, a clever and manipulative China, willing to allow the United States to take the lead, which in turn gave Beijing the option of playing the swing player role, which allowed it to increase both American and North Korean dependence on China. There's the calculatedly crazy North Korean regime, playing for time while it pushed ahead with its nuclear program, ultimately able to manipulate not only the United States, but also China, Japan, and South Korea to its own advantage. There's a picture of an inconstant South Korea under the Roh-Moo-Hyun regime, eager to play the mediation role between the United States and North Korea, but increasingly sidelined by both and increasingly finding its reputation in tatters. A narcissistic Japan whose agenda on North Korea was increasingly defined by the domestic politics of the abductee issue. And, I have to say, a largely passive and irrelevant Russia. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, this book stands as a manifesto of how not to conduct a multilateral denuclearisation process. It has lessons for all of the players involved. For the United States, how wasting a quality leadership and power is in international relations. For China as well, how tactical cleverness can lead to major strategic blunders. For South Korea, how an aggrandising diplomacy can lead to irrelevance, and for Japan, how narcissism leads to frustration and plunging prestige. But ultimately, I think the book shows that the six-party talks had pretty positive lessons for Pyongyang. One reads the book thinking how much this period must have added to the proliferator's playbook of how to string the international community along while ultimately going for your objectives. One thinks immediately about the ongoing talks that are currently occurring over the Iranian nuclear program and how closely some in Tehran may have been watching the bait and switch game being played on the Korean Peninsula during the 2000s. One hopes those at the other side of the table have been watching just as closely. In sum, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to reiterate just what a good book this is, what a good read it is, and what a lot you learn from these pages. I'm happy to launch this book, and I commend it to all of you. Thank you.
I think Michael did a very good job of summing up the book, very eloquently. I think he could do it more eloquently than myself, so I'm pleased with that. And your characterization of the various parties to the talks. Now, my hope is that the book will be read not by students, I see a number of students here in the audience today, or by academics, there are a few academics here as well, but by diplomats, people involved in the negotiating process. I know of at least one foreign ministry which assigns required reading to its recent graduates as they make the transition from the university to the real world. And my hope is that this book will be read by such people as well. It is a critical examination of the process of negotiation. But that is not all. As Michael mentioned, it deals with the major parties in North Korea, their aims, expectations, and frustrations. And as Michael mentioned, the six-party talks were praised in their time as a basis for Northeast Asian regionalism, or as the South Koreans put it, a future peace regime, and a building block in the effort to construct a regional order that would overcome the divisions of the Cold War. There was much talk about the possibilities of the six-party talks just after they were launched in August 2003. They went through 6 rounds, many sessions within those rounds, and ended in December 2008 and were not reconvened, and North Korea subsequently in April 2009 withdrew. So my question, aside from the other questions that Michael mentioned, my question was, why did they fail in their stated purpose? All parties were agreed that denuclearization of North Korea was the aim. That was supposedly the common objective. But North Korea managed to test its first nuclear device in October 2006, its second in May 2009, and then its third in February this year. And now South Koreans think that a fourth test may be in the offing. What went wrong? What actually happened? Parties had different views about how to go about the denuclearization process. They came into the negotiations with different agendas, some hidden, and some some purposes developed over time. And I mentioned in this book, in the first chapter, something about negotiation theory, but the essential point is that when all parties come together with open and hidden agendas, they react to each other. You have a process of interaction. The agendas change. The diplomatic and bargaining positions change over time as they react to each other. In particular, as China and Russia, and also South Korea under Roh Moo-hyun, reacted to the Bush administration and its very aggressive approach to this issue. Reasons for failure. The reason, in the popular imagination and public imagination, soon afterwards, heavy blame was laid at the door of the Bush administration. Its aggressive posture, its threat of attack on North Korea after the Iraqi invasion in 2003, its rigid insistence upon a commitment to denuclearization up front, and its effort to seek a solution that would uphold global non-proliferation policy. And the Bush administration and American administrations have had one eye on Iran. The effect that an agreement with North Korea would have on Iran has been a major and important restraint upon their efforts to bargain with the North. Now, this is a bit simplistic. There are other factors involved that I identify. China and Russia. Well, I mentioned China and Russia, and those two countries, if I was talking about them, the lights would indeed go off, and so would my microphone. So I would continue. Okay. Now, Russia, seemingly on the peripheries of the negotiation, but Russia teamed up with China, and Russia, let's not forget, has a veto in the UN Security Council, worked together with China to veto Security Council resolutions and to dilute them and to water them down. They sought a regional solution, to continue with the 1994 agreed program, the agreed framework, which was negotiated between the United States and North Korea. That is a freeze of the nuclear program, a promise of later verification, economic aid, and an American assurance that the United States would not attack the North, an assurance of non-aggression, which the North supposedly sought after the invasion of Iraq, and then open up the North to the outside world, and eventually down the track you would have a solution to the nuclear issue. So they wanted to reverse the process. First start with incentives, economic aid, pledge of non-aggression, and then later deal with the nuclear issue. Why was it the Bush administration, the United States, was not able to accept that position? It sought a global solution, one that could be applied to Iran as well. It sought to uphold non-proliferation norms, a non-proliferation policy. Where do you hold the line? This was an important factor, an important consideration for the United States. After India, Pakistan went through their nuclear tests in May 1988, where do you draw the line to uphold nuclear non-proliferation policy? So there were two problems with this from the American perspective. One was the postponement of verification. Verification is always at the heart of these agreements over nuclear weapons programs. And the postponement of verification would give little incentive for the North to surrender its nuclear weapons program. There's no guarantee that once you postpone the whole thing that you won't have a North Korea that will continue with its nuclear weapons program and receiving economic aid from the international community would have both things together, economic aid, assistance, and nuclear weapons. Now, why couldn't the Americans go back to the agreed framework? Clinton negotiated a deal with North Korea in October 1994, which ended the first nuclear crisis. And there was a lot of pressure upon the Americans to do just that, go back to the agreed framework. And the agreed framework basically meant postponement of verification and provision of a light water reactor to replace the graphite nuclear reactors that the North Koreans had. And it meant also deliveries of heavy fuel oil, which I won't go into. The point was that it largely postponed the major issues. Now, I also mention in the book that at the end of the Clinton administration's second term of office, there was an opportunity for the US to negotiate a similar deal with the North Koreans. If ever there was an opportunity, it was then. The Clinton administration could have done it. We all remember Clinton in the closing days of the administration. He was very eager to show the world a major diplomatic triumph. So he wanted to negotiate an agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians. He spent quite some time on that. And he also contemplated visiting Pyongyang to negotiate a major triumphal agreement with the North Koreans that would settle a nuclear issue. Now, the problem was that the Americans became very well aware that the North Koreans had something else up their sleeve. As well as the plutonium nuclear program, which was we have a Yongbyon reactor up there. They had acquired some of the nuclear technology from the A.Q. Khan network in Pakistan. A.Q. Khan, the rogue Pakistani nuclear scientist who developed a money-making organization peddling nuclear technology to various states, including North Korea. And North Korea obtained the technology, some of the technology, to develop a uranium-based nuclear program. And this was noted by US intelligence as early as 1998. They understood what was going on. So Clinton would have declared a victory, as was his wont. He would have come back with a sense of triumph, greeted the American people accordingly, but the whole thing would have been a sham. He would have fallen into a very bad trap that would have tarnished his reputation before history. So for the Bush administration, a return to this earlier agreement was unacceptable. You had very strong visceral reactions from George Bush. He loathed Kim Jong-il, he put North Korea in the axis of evil and so forth, refused to negotiate directly with the North. And from then on, in the negotiations, in the six-party talks, you had a contest between the American insistence on this global solution with denuclearization up front and China, Russia, South Korea under Roh Moo-hyun calling for a regional solution. Now, eventually, the Bush administration began to backtrack. It lost faith in China. It began to understand that the Chinese were not interested in pressing the North Koreans. It began to understand China's hidden agenda. Of course, publicly the Chinese said, number one on our agenda is the denuclearization of the North. So they told the Americans. They told them what they wanted to hear. But they had another agenda as well. And that was supporting the North, maintaining the North as an ally against the US, South Korean alliance, and against Japan as well. And this hidden agenda became understood through the talks. The United States approach to the six-party talks was very much a function of policy towards China. Engage China in the process of cooperation, develop cooperative links with Beijing, which could spill over and facilitate cooperation in other areas. Taiwan, for example, South China Sea, over economic issues. That's how and policy was largely in the hands of the State Department's China hands. And then it began to understood. The administration began to understand that things didn't quite work that way, that the Chinese had their own agenda. Not willing to press the North, and then indeed they would say one thing to the Americans and another thing to the North Koreans, it seemed. So the Bush administration then began to lose faith in the six-party talks. it then sought direct negotiations with the North. Now, here's a president who said that he would never negotiate directly with North Korea. This was his visceral hatred of everything that the North stood for. Yet, by the Berlin talks of January 2007, the United States was doing just that. And what is more, they came after a process of negotiation in 2008. They came very close to an agreement on verification. The Bush administration removed North Korea from the list of states sponsoring terrorism. Yes, they did that. Bush administration said earlier that it wouldn't do that, but it did. It started to backtrack. But they stumbled over the issue of verification. This occurred a number of times in the negotiation, 2005 as well. Verification was always a stumbling block. They couldn't get round it. And you had two departments or two sections in the State Department that had different views of the issue. You had the diplomats and those involved in the six-party talks, Chris Hill, for example, Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, who came close to the Chinese and Russian view. That is to say, just leave the question of verification alone for the moment, come to an agreement. And then you had the Verification and Compliance Bureau in the US State Department that criticized this approach. They saw this as fudging the issue of verification. So there were splits, not only in the US administration, but within the State Department as well. In any case, by that time, 2008, the North began to let it be known that it wasn't interested in negotiations that would target its nuclear program. It wanted to be treated as a nuclear power. It wanted the six-party talks to be changed, transformed from negotiating a reduction or the elimination of its nuclear weapons program to mutual nuclear weapons reductions between the United States and the North, because it was a nuclear power. And then it withdrew from the negotiations in April 2009. Now, there are a number of lessons I glean from this, aside from the structure of negotiations that I mentioned in the book, that the Bush administration should have gone into negotiations with a better understanding of the agenda of the others, the South Koreans and the Chinese in particular. This naivete about the Chinese position, to my mind, is rather startling. Another lesson is that the Americans cannot deal with this issue alone, North Korea. This is what the Clinton administration thought it could do. It could handle North Korea on its own. And this kind of pride in one's strength carried over into the Bush administration. And this was cleverly manipulated by the Chinese. Jiang Zemin told the Americans, North Korea is your problem. And they wanted to maneuver the Americans into the position where they would make the concessions and the Chinese would gain the benefits. It was only later the Bush administration realized the position it was in. So now you have an Obama administration that wants to maintain some detachment from these negotiations, telling the Chinese, no, it is not just our problem, it is your problem now. And indeed it is. It has become a Chinese problem. China complains about betrayal from the North, complains about Northern intransigence. This frustration of dealing with the North has spilled over, and the Chinese are more interested, more concerned about adhering to the financial sanctions that were passed earlier this year and also in 2009 by the UN Security Council in a resolution. But had the Chinese looked at this situation differently, had the Chinese understood that their efforts to protect the North together with the Russians, by vetoing some of these strictly worded Security Council resolutions. Had they been tougher with the North Koreans earlier, perhaps they would not have this sense of frustration today. And that arises because the Chinese simply assumed and wanted to push the problem to the Americans and let them solve it. Finally, six-party talks cannot work on the Korean Peninsula. They won't resolve the problems of North Korea. China presses for their resumption and supposedly has the North Koreans on side, supposedly, but they will come in with their demand to be treated as a nuclear power. So we have to think of something else. And this is why I conclude that there has to be a wider body to deal with the Korean Peninsula. A framework, a wider body that can establish, negotiate a framework for a settlement. Now, this is not new. Colin Powell in 2003 raised this issue of wider negotiations involving unspecified parties. But Colin Powell, as we know very well, was sacrificed by the neoconservatives in the administration. He didn't get a hearing at all. It was also raised by the Russian Foreign Ministry in 1994. They called for an 8-party proposal involving the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN Secretary General, to establish a credible denuclearization policy, one that would meet the IAEA, its requirements, and one that could be linked with economic aid and assistance in a long-term plan to deal with the problem of the North. I think that if efforts were made to bring the Russians on side and revive what Colin Powell said earlier, it would help to dislodge the Chinese eventually by simply refusing to reconvene the six-party talks, let the Chinese frustration with North Korea build up. Perhaps they would seek an alternative, especially if the Russians pushed their own proposal. So I think six-party talks are dead, yet everyone talks about them. The diplomats simply keep to the same thinking. This has become a public, one of the nostrums of our age, that the six-party talks can deal with this issue. We should be thinking otherwise. And I end at that point.
Ladies and gentlemen, LESEX agreed to answer questions and participate in discussion. We've got about 20 minutes for that. Can I invite questions, comments, reactions from the floor?
Based on your analysis of the six-party talks as they progressed and in-depth look at the negotiations, is North Korea, both in terms of its goals and its negotiating methodology, a state with which we can negotiate? Or is its understanding of the world simply so alien that no deal is possible?
I'm very sympathetic to those remarks because much evidence that we have about the North can lead to those conclusions. There's no point in negotiating with the North at this time, that it's unwilling to negotiate anyway. It feels very, it regards itself as a nuclear power. Why bother with the negotiation? Now, I think we will have to look down the track that at some point in time, the Chinese, one hopes, will exert greater pressure on the North to deal with this problem. The Russians will come in also. The Russians are developing their own connections with South Korea, trying to get a foot into the Korean Peninsula. Japanese are still out at the moment, as I mentioned in the book. So at some point in time down the track, it may become more feasible to negotiate with the North. But at the moment, it's not interested. If it is true that it's preparing for a fourth test in order to improve its nuclear technology, then it'll simply ignore all efforts to bring it into negotiations. But I see this as putting into place a framework for negotiation which could be used or invoked or applied in the future. We should be looking at the future. But I agree with you, not today.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I would like to first ask a question and ask whether or not the book deals with the wholly unethical, in my view, link between humanitarian aid and the six-party talks, because I think it's a very interesting aspect of the six-party talks. But the second question is, in your analysis of the six-party talks, did you ever contemplate whether or not the whole idea of the talks were going to fail because they were looking at the wrong problem, i.e., the problem of Korea is not the nuclear problem. The problem of Korea is the North Korean problem. That is, if you want to end the nuclear problem on the North, you need to bring about regime change. You need to bring about a whole change in North Korea, and that's going to happen through different means than the six-party talks. So I'd like to ask for your comments on that, particularly because if you look at what's going on in North Korea at the moment, it's China's engagement with North Korea that's bringing about the most change, rather than those who are isolationists, critical of China. I wonder if you can comment on those 2 points.
Basically, humanitarian aid, right?
And then link with the six-party talks.
But there was never a link between humanitarian aid and the six-party talks. So,
the agreements that were being given with the US and the agreements that were being given as part of the talks that were going on.
Humanitarian aid was rather separate from the six-party talks. They had a strict agenda. I don't think the humanitarian aid ever came up in the six-party talks. The nuclear issue, they discussed deliveries of fuel deliveries, heavy oil. They discussed provision of alternative light water reactors. They discussed, at times, the possibility of economic aid. They didn't get very far on that one, but humanitarian aid never came up and was always considered a separate issue handled by the governments concerned and handled by the aid agencies. So there was never a link.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, this description that you make on the different positions that the parties to the six-party talks had, particularly even with countries that are very close allies among themselves. So my question will be, what do you think that could be added by including the Secretary General you mentioned of the UN or the DG of the IAEA? Both organizations have, well, the IAEA has quite a few resolutions on the DPRK case. The General Assembly doesn't have any. It is essentially the Security Council, the one that it has. So probably both the Secretary General or the DG of the IA will need a sort of a mandate from their own organization, so that you have a much wider involvement there that will be needed. So if countries which are very close to themselves as allies cannot agree on the basics of the negotiation, how do you think that it will improve if you add the organizations that you mentioned, in which I think it will be important, they play a role, but in this stage of negotiations, I don't know. And then Another practical question, what does the DPRK has to bargain for anything but the nuclear weapons that they have and the nuclear program to get any other things that they might need?
Thank you for those questions. First one, would they ever agree if you had a wider body, if you had more parties? If you agreement, the major disagreements in the six-party talks occurred in the first rounds when the Bush administration was insistent upon denuclearization upfront, so-called CVID, and the other parties reacted to that and tried to undercut and undermine the American position. Now, once the Americans moved to backtrack and moved to another position and took on board some of the negotiating points of their partners, and that occurred, that's in the book there, occurred several times in 2004, 2005, when the Americans started to listen to the South Koreans, No Mu-hun, above all. Then they began to change their diplomatic style. So it's possible for the parties to agree upon a wider framework. It's possible to adopt the regional solution. China would accept that. Russia would accept that. That is to say, economic aid and assistance for the North. But you would have to have the IAEA, UN Secretary General, in order to prevent excessive departure from global non-proliferation policy of the kind that some of the parties wanted earlier along. They wanted a simple regional solution and postponement and verification. If you have a regime that includes a time plan for verification and not just budget the way the 1994 agreed framework did, just left it for the future, time plan, schedule, together with Chinese and Russians' proposals for dealing with the situation, I think you have a much better chance for success, especially if that time plan and schedule would be verified by the IAEA as being consistent with global non-proliferation norms and the UN Secretary General. I think that has a better chance of success. And what was your second point?
What are the things that they have to buy?
North Koreans, yes. Another question I'm very pleased you asked. North Korea. The idea of bargaining. It's often assumed, and I find it in my lectures when I lecture to people, students, they say, all this was a bargaining chip. This is a bargaining chip. Now, this is what popular imagination, the press, has attributed to the North Koreans. A desire to use the nuclear weapons program as a bargaining chip for economic aid and assistance. And in fact, it didn't come up in negotiations. At times, I spoke to some of the South Koreans involved in the negotiating process, and they was puzzled by what the North was doing. Sometimes they would call for this, then that would be forgotten, and then they would raise this, and that would be dropped, and then I'd talk about economic aid, and they would forget about economic aid. There was no consistent purpose in that sense, no consistent desire or no consistent plan to use the weapons program as a bargaining chip for economic aid or assistance or anything like that. In fact, they reflected the expectations and aspirations of the international community that this was indeed a bargaining chip. You think it is a bargaining chip? Okay, we'll tell you it is a bargaining chip. Give us some economic aid. So they went this way. Now, they played a very clever game. Now, in the book, I mentioned the idea of tacit bargaining. That is to say, you have normal bargaining, say, for example, over strategic arms limitation talks or talks over trade and so forth. Bargaining over concrete things. It's like bargaining in a market. Someone comes with their price, you come up with their price, you compromise, you have a deal. But tacit bargaining and the way the North Koreans went about it was very different. It sought to maximize their position and to give them time. They didn't really have a bargaining position because it changed. It would change according to the time. Sometimes it would be the lifting of financial sanctions. Sometimes it would be this. Sometimes it would be that. Sometimes it was a pledge from the US, pledge of non-aggression, which they would lose interest in after that. So all throughout, they were seemingly bargaining for time.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation, Professor Buszynski. My comments is based on a very simple question. Does North Korea have the ability to develop the nuclear weapon independently?
Has had the ability to?
To develop nuclear power weapon independently.
How independent? You mean they have nuclear weapons, right? So you mean to say, did they develop them independently? That's your question?
Yes, I just want to know, if they have the
question. A lot of this, the nuclear weapons program is shrouded in very great secrecy. So, you had something to add?
Yes, I mean, if not, who gives North Korea the key technology? I mean, we all know the situation in nowadays North Korea and South Korea is exactly the result of the balance of main powers after the World War II. Can we understand the six-party talks as a new form of such balance of power? Yeah, thank you very much.
Such what power?
The balance of power.
Balance power. Balance of power. Sorry, balance of power. Now, I'll deal with your first question, the origins. I will also talk about ballistic missiles. You didn't ask that question, but the two are linked for the North Koreans. Where do they get their technology? Now, the ballistic missile program, they're busy developing long-range ballistic missiles shrouded in considerable secrecy. We still don't know exactly where they got this technology. Some of it from Pakistan, and then the reverse flows to Pakistan. And also they acquired the technology to develop Soviet missiles, Soviet Scuds, and then they built on that technology to develop the missiles. But still shrouded in secrecy. Now what about their nuclear program? The Soviet Union gave the North Koreans the Yongbyon reactor originally, 1985-86. With the capacity to produce plutonium, and many of their scientists were trained in the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet Union collapsed. They had at least rudimentary ability to develop a nuclear program because of the Soviet input. And that immediately resulted in their first efforts to extract plutonium from the Yongbyon reactor in 1993, which triggered the first nuclear crisis. So if you want to see a thread here, it goes back to the old Soviet Union and the ability of Soviet-trained North Korean nuclear scientists to develop this technology. Then also the uranium enrichment facility has been linked with Pakistan in terms of because North Korea has uranium. Pakistan has not, and there's been, according to what we think, there's been some trade in plutonium and uranium between them. So they've acquired some of this technology from Pakistan as well to develop uranium-enriched technology. Now, some people have speculated that if North Korea tests another nuclear device, a fourth nuclear device. Some people have speculated that this one will be a uranium device, not a plutonium device. What they need to have a fourth test in order to bring their uranium program to completion, to show that they have an alternative besides the plutonium program.
So can you say some countries from the North parties give North Korea the key technology directly or indirectly?
Soviet Union in the past.
So, and they give the North Korea the technology and now say, we will forbid you.
Yeah, Russia then, yes, I won't go into Russian reactions with in regard to the North, but I undertook a special trip to Vladivostok to look at the Russian side, spoke to Russians there, and they were appalled, North Korea, that what North Korea was doing with Soviet technology, because they feel threatened. Yeah. So yes, but they can't stop it, because no cutoff after the event would hurt the North Korean program. They'll go ahead independently now.
You mentioned how Clinton and Bush both kind of pursued solving the North Korea problem almost as legacy issues late in their presidencies. How do you see Obama's current approach playing out towards the end of his term as president?
I don't think Obama can do otherwise with regard to North Korea. What are the options? Be pushed into negotiating with the North, become the main player again, and repeat the mistakes of the past? No. Become diplomatically active over this issue? When the Chinese really hold the cards, they determine the progress of negotiations over this issue. So the Obama administration is playing a skillful game, trying to play a skillful game, maintain a sense of detachment, and to maneuver the Chinese into the position where they will exercise some influence over the North. Now that will take time. That's the only thing that the present administration can do. Looking at past mistakes, they've come to this conclusion.
Just turning to China, given the value of nuclear brinksmanship to the North Korean regime and its apparent fragility, can China apply sufficiently nuanced leverage to change North Korean policy without risking collapse?
This is, of course, the Chinese argument. The Chinese have always said that we have no influence over the North. Our influence is very limited. They fear the collapse of North Korea. You're quite right. And the North has been able to bargain with the threat of its own collapse, hasn't it? It says, if you press us, we're going to collapse. And you're going to have a terrible situation on your hands. But between these two extreme scenarios, doing nothing and collapse, there are other options, graduated options that the Chinese didn't exercise. Chinese could do more. Now, the Chinese banks are imposing financial sanctions on the North, right? They could have done that a lot earlier. They could have sent a more determined signal to the Northern regime earlier, before they tested their first nuclear device. And they could have said, we are serious about this. You have to stop this. Now, there was a time in 2003 when we suspect that the Chinese, there's an oil pipeline between China and North Korea. Around February 2003, in order to hustle the North Koreans into negotiations, they cut off the oil pipeline for a few days, citing technical reasons. And that's the Chinese way. They won't say, they won't reveal their hand up front, and that could have been sufficient to bring the North Koreans into what were then the Beijing three-party talks. They could have done something like that. They could have exerted greater pressure upon the North. They could have contained the effects. So there would have been an alternative between those two extremes. They could have to avert collapse. So now we're seeing that the Chinese, in their frustration with the North, are doing just that, trying to exert pressure on the North, trying to push the North into participating in negotiations again. If they can do that now, why didn't they do that earlier?
I think one last question.
Les, thank you for that. I have two questions, essentially questions of clarification. You say that, and I'm sure this is true, that the bargaining positions of the different parties changed over time. But when you look at the whole history of the six-party talks, what do you assume the DPRK wants? And then the second question is, given that the DPRK now has a minimal nuclear capability, do you think there is anything that any of the other 5 countries or any combination of countries can do to convince the DPRK regime to give up the nuclear capability that it's got?
Okay, second question first. I tried to address that question in response to Mr. Ambassador's comment here, that if you put a framework in place involving the wider international community, get China on board, you have to get China on board, so you have to take on board their proposal as well for a solution, involve IAEA, and there are some proposals, as some proposals have it, Australia should be involved. Australia has become a regional player. It's possible to then envisage a scenario where there are several assumptions in this scenario where the northern regime will come under sufficient pressure to the extent that it would respond. Now, we're looking at the future. The assumptions I mentioned are that North Korea changes, North Korea doesn't collapse, that you have, as some people have argued, you have a North Korean Gorbachev, for example, someone who wants to open the country to the outside world. You have a number of assumptions there before you get to that conclusion. It's not impossible, it's not infeasible. The alternatives are far worse. We would be risking a collapse scenario or risking even a conflict scenario. The first point, what does North Korea want? Now, I break up that question into two. What does it want now? What did it want in the past during the six-party negotiations? Now, when I piece together the information that I've obtained from various sources, including interview sources, I get the following picture. That there are two processes going on in the North at that time. Now, popular imagination has it that there was only one. The six-party talks, negotiations, and the six-party talks were immediately linked with the nuclear program. Six-party talks would come to an agreement, nuclear program would stop. That was a direct connection. But I find fault with that. The second process was the nuclear weapons program, of which we know very little, but we have some insight. And the diplomats involved in negotiating in six-party talks had little understanding of what was going on in their own regime because the system is highly compartmentalized. It's only on a need-to-know basis. And they were kept on a very tight leash. They were told what to negotiate, what to raise, and what not to raise. What they could raise and what they could not. And then they would revert to Central HQ for directions and instructions very often. So what did they want? With the second track, the development of the nuclear program, they wanted to, especially after the American invasion of Iraq, 2003, we see a surge towards the development of nuclear weapons. That seemed to be a precipitating factor. Before then, there seemed to be some doubt about their technology, whether they could do it. Some interest in reverting to the 1994 agreed framework with the United States, providing they had a nuclear reserve they could keep under wraps. But after 2003, we see this surge of interest, this effort. So what they wanted after 2003 was to develop a nuclear program, and their diplomats were basically, this was a public relations front for a government that was hell-bent on developing nuclear weapons after 2003, not necessarily before. Now, what does North Korea want now? Difficult to fathom exactly how the regime can extricate itself from its current predicament. It wants recognition as a nuclear power. It wants some kind of limited aid and support on its own terms, but not too much. I think that they really want to, if it's at all possible, to have some kind of direct negotiations with Americans and Chinese as a nuclear power, to be treated like India and Pakistan, basically. I think they seem to be angling for that in terms of their nuclear program. But they're very preoccupied with other things as well. Sheer survival, regime survival. And that's a very uncertain factor in terms of the future. That's my understanding.
Thank you. Well, Leszek, I think you can tell by the quality of the discussion and the questions that this is ostensibly a book about something that happened in the past, the six-party talks, but it's really about the present and the future. And it's not only about North Korea, it's potentially about Iran, it's potentially about a range of other countries as well and situations. So congratulations. It's a remarkable achievement. It's a good book. I once again commend it to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming along this evening. Please do join us outside for some drinks and nibbles. And please watch the NSC website. We've got, in about 3 weeks' time, a exciting series of events which we're dubbing internally Cyber Week. So please watch out for what's happening there and do come along. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan.